No one in that room knew a maid was about to decide whether the Duke of Ashcroft lived or died. The candlelight at Ashcroft Abbey fell like gold dust over the long dining hall, catching the crystal, the silver, the bare shoulders of women who had spent their whole lives learning how to be looked at. Pauline Roberts was not one of them. She stood behind the service door with a tray pressed to her stomach, watching the world she would never belong to, and telling herself, as she always did, that watching was enough. It was not enough tonight. Duke Edmund Sterling sat at the head of the table, his dark coat trimmed in gold thread, his shoulders straight in the way men were taught from birth to hold them. Beside him sat Lady Cordelia Kensington, his bride-to-be, a vision in ivory silk, her smile so smooth it looked painted on. The whole room glittered with the kind of joy that only comes from money, and Pauline had learned long ago that joy like that was usually borrowed from someone else's suffering. She had carried wine to that table 100 times. She knew the weight of the decanters, the particular hush that fell when a toast was about to be made. She knew, too, the small service door that let her come and go like a ghost, seen by no one, remembered by no one. So when Cordelia rose, just slightly, and turned her body half away from the table, no one noticed but Pauline. A small glass vial slipped from Cordelia's glove. Pauline's breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. One drop fell into Edmund's wine, then another. Cordelia's hand was so practiced, so unhurried, that if Pauline had blinked even once, she would have missed it entirely. The vial vanished back into the folds of silk as quickly as it had appeared, and Cordelia turned back to the table with that same smooth, untroubled smile, as though she had only adjusted her glove. Pauline's heart slammed against her chest so hard she thought the whole hall might hear it. A tonic, she told herself. A perfume. Something a lady carried for her nerves. But nothing harmless is hidden inside a glove. Nothing innocent is poured in secret. The toastmaster called for the engagement toast. Edmund lifted his glass, and the whole room lifted theirs in answer, a forest of crystal catching candlelight. The seconds stretched unbearably, the way time sometimes does when a decision can no longer be postponed, and Pauline became aware of every small detail in the hall with a clarity that frightened her. The particular shade of red in the wine, the soft murmur of 300 conversations pausing at once, the warmth of the candles against her face, the cold sweat gathering at the back of her own neck. If she stayed silent and she was wrong, no one would ever know, and her conscience would carry the doubt alone. If she stayed silent and she was right, a man would drink poison in front of 300 witnesses, and she would have let it happen, because speaking was dangerous for a maid. She thought of her mother, who had died of fever the year Pauline turned 16, in a back room with no physician, because such things were spent on people of better blood. She thought of every time she had lowered her eyes and swallowed her opinion, because a maid's voice was worth less than the silence around it. Edmund Sterling raised the glass to his lips. Pauline Roberts ran. She did not remember crossing the floor. She remembered only the doors swinging open under her hands, the gasp that rippled through the hall like wind through wheat, 300 faces turning toward a maid who had no business being seen, let alone heard. "Don't drink that, Your Grace." The words tore out of her before she had decided to say them, raw and too loud for the room. And for one terrible moment, but nothing happened at all. The Duke simply stared at her over the rim of his glass, his dark eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in something closer to confusion, as though he could not work out why a servant girl in a plain dress was shouting his name across his own engagement banquet. Then the room exploded into noise. "Insolence!" someone hissed. "Remove her," said another. Cordelia's hand flew to her chest, her face arranging itself into the perfect mask of wounded innocence. "She has lost her senses," she said, her voice trembling with practiced fragility. "Edmund, the poor girl is hysterical. Someone help her before she embarrasses herself further." Pauline felt the eyes of the entire room land on her like stones. She had broken every rule she had ever been taught. She had spoken without being spoken to. She had touched the sacred silence of a noble gathering and shattered it in front of witnesses who would remember her name only as a cautionary tale. But Edmund Sterling did not drink. He set the glass down slowly, his eyes never leaving Pauline's face, and the hall seemed to hold its breath along with her. "Why?" he said, his voice quiet enough that the room had to lean in to hear it. "Would you say such a thing, Miss Roberts?" He knew her name. Pauline had not expected that. In a house with 40 servants, the Duke of Ashcroft Abbey knew the name of the girl who carried his linens. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, and her voice shook though she willed it not to. "I saw something. By the service door. I saw Lady Cordelia put something into your wine." The silence that followed was the kind that presses on the ears like water. Cordelia laughed, a high, bright, brittle sound. "This is absurd. I have done nothing but adjust my glove all evening. Edmund, surely you do not believe a servant's fancy over your own betrothed?" Edmund looked at the glass. He looked at Cordelia. He looked, longest of all, at Pauline, who stood frozen in the doorway with her hands trembling at her sides, waiting to be thrown out into the night for the crime of trying to save his life. "Bring Dr. Clark," Edmund said at last. "Test the wine before anyone else is poured a glass." A murmur went through the hall like a held breath finally released. Cordelia's smile did not waver, but something behind her eyes went still and sharp, like a blade catching light for the first time. Pauline did not move from the doorway. She did not know, in that moment, whether she had just saved a man's life or ended her own. Footmen moved past her in a blur, fetching the physician, clearing the table, ushering shocked guests toward the drawing rooms where brandy and gossip could flow more freely than they could at a table still holding a glass that might be poisoned. Pauline stood rooted to the same spot, watching the chaos she had caused ripple outward in every direction, and she understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than the accusation itself, that there was no path backward from this moment. Whatever happened next, the invisible girl who had spent 8 years learning how to disappear into corners had just made herself the single most visible person in the county. A footman she barely knew brushed past her shoulder and muttered, low enough that only she could hear it. "You have signed your own dismissal tonight, Roberts. Mark my words." She didn't answer him. She did not have the breath to spare for an answer. Her whole body had become a single-held note of fear, waiting to learn whether the music around her would resolve into relief or ruin. No one slept at Ashcroft Abbey that night. Candles burned in windows that were ordinarily dark by midnight, and servants who should have been abed instead gathered in low knots along the corridors, trading the same question in whispers that grew more frightened with every retelling. Had the Duke truly been poisoned, and by his own bride's hand, in front of the entire county? Pauline Roberts had spent 8 years learning how to disappear. She had come to Ashcroft Abbey at 14, the year her father's small farm failed, and Mrs. Mabel Shaw had taken her in because the house needed hands, and a girl willing to work was worth more than a girl with connections. She had polished silver until her own reflection stared back at her, distorted and small. She had carried linens through corridors longer than the street she grew up on, and learned that the maids who were noticed were the maids who made mistakes. Invisibility was not a punishment. It was how a girl like her stayed fed. She had watched the Duke from a distance for 2 years, the way one watches weather rather than people, something powerful and far away that shaped the climate of the whole house without ever touching the ground beneath it. She knew he read late into the night, because she swept the ash from his hearth each morning. She knew Cordelia Kensington had been chosen for him by his late mother's old friends, land and lineage, rather than affection. None of it had ever felt like it belonged to her to know. It was simply the private collection a servant gathers without meaning to, scraps of a life lived too close to be unseen and too far away to ever be known. That life had ended the moment she ran across the hall. Whatever came next, she would not be invisible again. Dr. Ambrose Clark arrived within the hour, summoned from his bed, his coat thrown on over his nightshirt, his bag clutched to his chest like a man called to a deathbed. He worked in the small drawing room with the door closed, testing the wine with the careful, unhurried patience that came from having seen too many noble households hide their poisons behind politeness. Pauline waited in the servants' corridor, her back against the cold stone wall, her hand still trembling, though hours had passed since she had spoken. Mrs. Mabel Shaw, the housekeeper, found her there, arms crossed over her wide bosom, her face unreadable in the candlelight. "You have caused quite a storm tonight, girl," Mrs. Shaw said. "I know," Pauline whispered. "Do you know what happens to maids who accuse their betters and are wrong?" Pauline's throat tightened. "Yes, ma'am." "And what happens to maids who are right and accuse them anyway?" Pauline looked up. "I don't know, ma'am. I have never heard of it happening before." Mrs. Shaw's mouth twitched, something between a frown and the beginning of respect. "No," she said. "Neither have I." The drawing-room door opened. Charles Goodwin, the Duke's valet, stepped out first, his face the colour of old parchment. Behind him came Edmund, and behind Edmund, Dr. Clark, holding a small vial of wine up to the candlelight, as though it were evidence in a trial that had not yet begun, but soon would. "Your Grace," Dr. Clark said, "the wine contains a compound I have seen only twice before, in cases of slow and deliberate poisoning. It would not have killed you tonight. It works over weeks, weakness, confusion, a trembling in the hands, a clouding of the mind. Taken steadily, it would have left you appearing unfit to manage your own affairs within a season." News of the physician's findings spread through Ashcroft Abbey faster than any fire could have travelled its corridors. By breakfast, every scullery maid and stable boy in the house knew that the wine had truly been poisoned, and the easy scorn that had greeted Pauline's accusation the night before curdled in many mouths into a nervous, uncertain respect that none of them quite knew how to offer a girl they had laughed at only hours earlier. Some avoided her eyes entirely, ashamed of how quickly they had called her hysterical. Others watched her with something closer to suspicion, as though a maid who could see what nobility could not was a dangerous thing to have living among them, however useful her warning had proven to be. Pauline found she wanted neither their shame nor their suspicion. She wanted only to understand what came next, and whether the truth she had spoken aloud would be enough, in a house built on rank, to protect her from the consequences of having spoken it at all. The hallway went silent enough that Pauline could hear the candle flames hiss. "Unfit," Edmund repeated, the word landing like a stone dropped down a well. "Someone wished it to look as though illness had taken your reason, Your Grace," Dr. Clark said. "Not your life, your authority." Edmund's jaw tightened. He turned, and for the first time that night, he looked directly at Pauline, standing small and pale against the corridor wall. "You saved more than my life tonight, Miss Roberts," he said quietly. You saved my name." Pauline did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and dropped into the curtsy she had been trained to perform 1,000 times, though her knees had never shaken through one before. She thought the worst of the night was behind her. She was wrong. A young footman found the vial first, sweeping the servants' quarters before dawn, and the news travelled through the house faster than any servant's feet could carry it themselves, passed mouth to mouth like a flame jumping from one dry branch to the next, until it reached Pauline before she had even finished dressing for the morning's work, delivered by a scullery maid, too frightened to meet her eyes while she said it. By morning, the entire household was awake with whispers, and the whispers were not kind. A vial, empty and unmarked, had been found tucked behind Pauline's trunk in the servants' quarters. Cordelia stood in the housekeeper's office, with her chin lifted and her eyes bright with righteous fury, declaring that she had suspected the maid's jealousy for weeks, that a girl who served wine to a future duchess might well have wished, in some small, twisted corner of her heart, to ruin the happiness she could never have for herself. She invented the entire accusation to hide her own crime, Cordelia said, her voice carrying down the corridor where half the staff had gathered to listen. I have done nothing but show kindness to that girl, and this is how she repays a house that gave her bread and shelter. Pauline stood before Edmund in the library an hour later, summoned like a criminal awaiting sentence, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had gone white. "I did not put anything in your wine, Your Grace," she said, before he could speak. "I would stake my life on it. I would stake it gladly, because it is the truth." Edmund studied her for a long moment. There was something in his face she could not name yet, something careful and considering, as though he were weighing her not as a duke weighs a servant, but as one person weighs the honesty of another. "I believe you," he said finally. Relief washed through her so suddenly her knees nearly gave. "But I cannot say so. Not yet." His voice dropped, urgent and low. "If I defend you now, in front of the whole house, Cordelia will know I suspect her, and she will destroy whatever evidence remains before we can find it. I need you to endure their suspicion a little longer, Miss Roberts. I need the world to believe I doubt you, while I do not doubt you at all." Pauline swallowed hard. "You want me to let them think I am a liar?" "I want them to think I think you are a liar," Edmund said. "There is a difference, though I know it will not feel like one." She left him in the library that night, believing the conversation had ended, but he found her again within the hour, standing alone in the cold stone corridor outside the servants' stair, her arms wrapped around herself against a draught that crept through every gap in the old building's bones. She had not realized how badly she was shaking until he appeared in front of her, his own coat already half off his shoulders. "You will catch a chill," he said, and before she could protest that a duke did not undress in a corridor for the benefit of a maid, he had settled the coat around her shoulders himself, his hands lingering a moment longer than the gesture required, smoothing the collar against her neck, as though the simple act of warming her mattered more to him than anything being whispered about either of them in the rooms above. "Your Grace, this is not proper," Pauline said, though she did not shrug the coat away, and the warmth of it, still holding the shape of his body, undid something in her chest she had no name for yet. "Very little about tonight has been proper," Edmund said, "and yet here we are, alive, with the truth still ours to find. I think we may permit ourselves one small comfort in exchange for everything else this night has cost us both." She held the coat closed at her throat and said nothing further, because there was nothing further to say that would not betray exactly how much that small comfort had cost her composure, and how gladly she would have paid the price again. It did not feel like one. For 3 days, Pauline moved through Ashcroft Abbey under a cloud of cold stares and colder silences. Maids who had once shared bread with her in the kitchen now turned their faces away. Footmen muttered when she passed. Even old Mrs. Shaw, who Pauline suspected understood the truth, kept her distance in front of the others, for the sake of the lie that was protecting them both. Only Charles Goodwin found small ways to be kind, leaving an extra log on her fire, a kind word in passing corridors when no one else could hear. "My lord trusts you," Charles told her quietly one evening, polishing a boot he did not need to polish, simply to have an excuse to linger near her. He has not said so plainly, but I have served him 11 years, and I know the difference between his cold face and his calculating one. What you are seeing now is calculation, Miss Roberts, not condemnation. It feels the same from where I am standing, Pauline said. I imagine it does, Charles admitted, but endure it a little longer. The truth is being gathered, thread by thread, and a duke does not gather threads for a maid he believes guilty. The investigation, once it began in earnest, moved like water finding cracks in stone, slow, patient, and impossible to stop. Charles discovered the first thread within the week, buried in a stack of correspondence meant for burning. Altered estate papers, the wax seals broken and reset with such careful skill that only a trained eye would notice the slight misalignment of the Ashcroft crest. Someone has been rewriting the terms of the estate, Charles said, laying the papers across Edmund's desk in the library. Should anything happen to your capacity to manage your own affairs, Your Grace, these documents grant control of Ashcroft's finances to your wife absolutely, with no provision for a guardian or trustee to oversee her decisions. Edmund's face had gone the colour of ash. Cordelia would have owned everything, the land, the tenants, the mills, all of it, the moment I was declared unfit. There is a name here as well, Charles said, pointing to a signature at the bottom of one page, small and careful, easy to overlook. Sebastian Vaughan. Edmund's mouth tightened into a thin line. I know that name. A gambler. Disgraced from 2 clubs for debts he never paid. He has a talent for forging documents that has kept him fed since his family disowned him. Charles's discovery of the forged papers sent the household searching for further proof, and on the second of those long nights, Edmund asked Pauline to help him search the old library shelves for correspondence between his late father and the Kensington estate, records that might reveal how long this scheme had been building beneath the surface of a courtship that had never, perhaps, been real at all. They worked by a single candle, careful not to wake the house, pulling ledgers and letters from shelves that had not been disturbed in a decade. The library smelled of old leather and dust and the particular cold that settled into rooms too rarely used, and Pauline found herself more aware of the small space between her shoulder and Edmund's than she was of the papers in her hands. Their fingers found the same drawer at the same moment, reaching for the same bundle of letters tied in faded ribbon, and the brush of his hand against hers stilled them both completely. Neither moved to pull away. The candle flickered between them, throwing soft gold light across his face, and for a long, suspended breath, neither of them reached for the letters at all. Pauline, he said, quietly, testing her name without its title for the first time, as though he were trying the shape of something forbidden and finding he did not want to put it down. She did not correct him. She could not have, even if some part of her had wanted to, because her whole body had gone still and warm and aware in a way that had nothing to do with the cold library around them. We should find the letters, she said softly, though she did not move her hand from beneath his. We should, Edmund agreed, and made no move to retrieve them either. It was the distant chime of the hall clock, striking 2, that finally broke the spell, and they returned to their search with flushed faces and careful silence, both of them aware that something had shifted between them that neither was yet permitted to name aloud. It was Pauline, 2 nights later, who found the second thread, though she had not gone looking for it. She had been carrying linens past the music room when she heard Cordelia's voice through the half-open door, low and urgent, speaking to no one Pauline could see. Pauline pressed herself against the wall in the shadow of the corridor, her heart hammering, and listened. "He suspects nothing," Cordelia was saying. "The maid is being watched, but watched is not believed. Once we are married, none of it will matter. I will have what I came for, and you will have your share, Sebastian, as promised." A man's voice answered, low and oily. And if the physician speaks of the wine to the wrong ears, he has already spoken to the only ears that matter, and Edmund is too proud to admit publicly that his bride tried to poison him. Pride is a wonderful thing to build a marriage upon, Sebastian. It keeps men silent in all the most useful ways. Pauline heard the rustle of paper, and then Cordelia's voice again, colder now, stripped of its honeyed warmth. "Burn the letter once you have read it. I will not have my own hand used as evidence against me." Pauline did not wait to hear more. She found Edmund in the library within the quarter hour, breathless, the linens forgotten somewhere in the hallway behind her. "There is a letter," she said, before he could ask what had brought her to him at such an hour. "Cordelia means to have it burned. Tonight." Edmund rose so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "Where?" "The music room. I do not know if it has been burned already." They went together, through corridors lit only by the candle Pauline carried, her hand shaking enough that the flame trembled with every step. The music room was empty when they arrived, the fire low and banked, but Pauline's eyes caught the corner of a paper, curling black at the edges, half consumed, lying just inside the grate. She did not think. She reached into the fire and pulled the letter free before the flame could finish what it had started, and pain bloomed bright and sharp across her fingertips a moment later, when the danger she had ignored finally caught up to her body. "Pauline." Edmund's voice cracked on her name, stripped suddenly of every careful title. Every distance rank had built between them. He was beside her in an instant, prying the singed paper gently from her burned hand, setting it aside on the table before he took her hand in both of his, turning it toward the candlelight to see the damage. He found a small jar of salve in the desk drawer, the kind Mrs. Shaw kept stocked throughout the house for exactly such small domestic accidents, and worked it gently into the burn with a care that seemed strange, coming from hands more accustomed to holding the reins of a horse or the seal of a dukedom than tending another person's wounds. "It is nothing," Pauline said, though her eyes were watering from the pain. "It is not nothing." He said it quietly, almost to himself, his thumb tracing carefully along the edge of the burn, as though touching her wrong might hurt her further. "You did not have to do that." "I could not let it burn." Her voice had gone soft, breathless, in a way that had nothing to do with the pain in her hand, and everything to do with the warmth of his fingers around hers, the closeness of him in the dim room, the way his dark eyes had stopped looking at her like a duke looks at a servant, and started looking at her like a man looks at someone he is afraid of losing. "You are not trouble, Miss Roberts," he said, quietly. "You have never been trouble. You are the reason I am still standing in this house, at all." The letter, once cooled and read by candlelight, confirmed everything Charles had already suspected, and more. Cordelia's hand, elegant even in treachery, had written words that would end her. "Once he is mine by law, His weakness will become my authority. Edmund folded the letter slowly, his face unreadable, grief and fury moving beneath it like currents under still water. She was never going to love me, he said quietly. She was only ever going to own me. Pauline did not know what comfort to offer a duke who had just learned his bride wanted his ruin more than his hand. So she offered the only thing she had ever had to give. "I am sorry," she said, "for what it is worth from someone like me." Edmund looked at her then, really looked, in the candlelight with her burned hand still resting in his. "It is worth more than you know," he said. "It is worth more than anything Cordelia has ever offered me, true or otherwise." Chapter 4. The Coward's Mask. In the days that followed the burned letter, Edmund Sterling became a man performing two lives at once. In public, he was cool toward Pauline, distant in a way that made the other servants whisper that perhaps the maid's accusation had finally worn through his patience. In private, behind locked doors, in stolen hours after the household slept, he was someone else, entirely. A man pulling at every thread Charles and Mrs. Shaw could find, building a case thick enough that Cordelia could not talk her way free of it when the moment came. Cordelia, for her part, had grown bolder in her suspicion of Pauline rather than less, as though some animal instinct beneath her polished manners sensed the danger circling closer, even as her conscious mind remained certain of her own safety. She found excuses to summon Pauline to her chambers, small and unnecessary tasks performed under the guise of ordinary service, while her eyes studied Pauline's face for any sign of what she knew. "You have caused my betrothed a great deal of trouble, Miss Roberts," Cordelia said one afternoon, watching Pauline fold linens with the lazy attention of a cat watching a mouse it had not yet decided to catch. "I do hope, for your own sake, that you have learned the value of silence since that unfortunate evening." "I have learned a great many things since that evening, my lady," Pauline answered carefully, keeping her eyes on the linens rather than on Cordelia's face, afraid that her own expression might betray more than her words. "How fortunate for you," Cordelia said, "that his grace is so very forgiving a man. Were I in his position, I confess I should not have been nearly so patient with a servant who humiliated me in front of 300 guests." Pauline said nothing further, and Cordelia, apparently satisfied that she had drawn no blood worth noting, swept from the room in a rustle of silk, leaving Pauline's hands trembling over linens she no longer saw. "You must keep distance from her in front of the staff," Edmund told Pauline that same evening, in the small study where they had taken to meeting once the house had gone dark. "If Cordelia believes you are still under suspicion, she will not feel the need to flee before we have everything we need." "I understand," Pauline said. "I do not enjoy it, but I understand it." "Do you think me a coward for pretending to doubt you?" Pauline considered the question longer than she needed to, because she liked the way he waited for her answer instead of assuming it, the way no man of his rank had ever waited for anything from her before. "I think you are careful," she said finally. "There is a difference between a coward and a man protecting something fragile until it is strong enough to survive being seen." Edmund's mouth curved, the first real smile she had seen from him in days. "You speak boldly for someone in danger, Miss Roberts." "Respectfully, Your Grace," Pauline said. "Danger has been speaking boldly to me all evening." He laughed, low and surprised, as though the sound had escaped him before he could decide whether laughter belonged in a week like this one. "Charles tells me I have less terror facing Parliament than I show when you enter a room." "Mr. Goodwin should mind his tongue," Pauline said, though warmth was climbing up her neck despite herself. "Mr. Goodwin," Edmund said, has served me 11 years and earned the right to say what he sees. And what he sees, apparently, is true. The study had grown very quiet. The fire cracked low in the grate, and the candlelight made everything in the small room feel closer than it was, the space between them shrinking without either of them choosing to close it. "You should not look at me the way you are looking at me," Pauline said softly, though she did not look away. "And how am I looking at you?" "Like I am something other than a maid." "You have never been only a maid to me," Edmund said. "I think you stopped being only a maid the moment you ran across my own banquet hall to save a life nobody else in that room was watching closely enough to save." He reached for her hand, the one that had healed slowly over the week since the fire, and turned it gently in his, tracing the faint pink line where the burn had been. Pauline's breath caught, and she did not pull away, though every rule she had ever been taught told her she should. "Men like you do not marry women like me," she said, though the words came out smaller than she intended, less a fact than a question she was afraid to ask directly. "Then perhaps men like me have been cowards for generations," Edmund said, "hiding behind rules that protect nothing but our own comfort." Neither of them moved closer. Neither of them moved away. The fire burned low, and the silence between them said everything that society would never permit them to say aloud, and when Pauline finally rose to leave, her hand lingered in his, a moment longer than necessary, neither of them quite ready to be the one who let go first. It was Mrs. Shaw who found the final piece, 2 weeks later, in a conversation she should not have overheard and chose to repeat anyway. "The Kensington family is finished," she told Edmund plainly, standing in his study with her hands folded before her, the way she always stood when delivering news she considered her duty rather than her pleasure. "I have it from the housekeeper at Kensington Park herself, an old friend of mine. 3 mortgages on the estate. Gambling debts owed across half of London. Lady Cordelia's father has been selling off silver and pretending it was lost in a fire that never happened. And Sebastian Vaughan? Owed money by the family for 2 years. He offered his particular talents in exchange for a promise of future access to your fortune, once Cordelia controlled it. A debt repaid with a debt created. It is an old trick, Your Grace, and an ugly one." Edmund sat back in his chair, the full shape of the conspiracy finally visible to him in one unbroken line. A desperate family, a disgraced forger, a bride who had never wanted his heart at all, only the keys to everything he owned. "She would have watched me grow weaker every day," he said quietly, and called it love the entire time. "Some people mistake possession for affection, Your Grace," Mrs. Shaw said. "It is a common confusion among those who have never been taught the difference." Edmund gathered Charles and Mrs. Shaw in his study the week before the ball, laying every piece of evidence across his desk like a general arranging troops before a battle he intended to win cleanly, without unnecessary casualties among the innocent. "We expose her in front of witnesses who have no loyalty to the Kensington name," he said. "Not here, where half the guests have dined at her father's table for 20 years, and might be tempted to doubt evidence over old friendship. At Harrogate, the room will judge only what it sees, and what it sees will be undeniable." "And Miss Roberts?" Charles asked. "Will she attend?" "She will attend," Edmund said, "and she will stand where every person in that room can see exactly who saved this house, because I will not have her truth whispered about in corners any longer. If society is to learn what kind of woman she is, they will learn it standing in full candlelight, not hidden behind a service door." Mrs. Shaw said nothing, but the look she gave Edmund across the desk carried more approval than any words could have managed, and she left the study already planning, in her own quiet way, exactly which gown in the house might be made to fit a maid who was about to become something the household had no proper word for yet. The Duchess of Harrogate's annual ball was, by tradition, the largest gathering of the season outside of Ashcroft Abbey itself, and Edmund chose it deliberately, because Cordelia would never suspect a public exposure in a house that was not her own, surrounded by witnesses who owed her family nothing. Pauline had not been meant to attend. Maids did not attend balls, but Edmund had sent for her 3 days before, presenting her not with an order, but with a request delivered so carefully it felt like an apology for every rule that had kept her invisible until now. "I would like you there," he said. "Not in the kitchens, not by the service door, in the room itself, dressed as the woman you are, when the truth is finally spoken aloud." "People will talk," Pauline said. "People are already talking," Edmund said. "Let them talk about something worth the breath." Mrs. Shaw had taken charge of the dress herself, a deep blue silk that had belonged, she said, only once, and never again, to a daughter she had lost many years before the war had taken her husband too. Pauline stood before the mirror that evening, barely recognizing the woman looking back at her, and for one strange, suspended moment, she allowed herself to imagine a life where this was simply who she was, rather than who she had borrowed for a night. "Stand still, girl, or I shall stick you with this pin, and you will go to that ball bleeding instead of beautiful," Mrs. Shaw muttered, around a mouthful of pins, tightening the last lace at Pauline's back. "Your Grace, I have run this household for 27 years. If someone intends to commit murder in my dining room, I should at least like the courtesy of being informed first, and I should very much like a little more notice next time so I might prepare a proper dress without scorching my fingers on a hot iron at midnight." Pauline laughed despite the nerves twisting in her stomach, the first real laugh she had managed in days. "I will try to arrange my scandals further in advance next time, Mrs. Shaw." "See that you do," the housekeeper said, but her eyes, when Pauline caught them in the mirror, were soft with something that looked very much like pride. Charles arrived to escort them to the carriage, resplendent in his own evening coat, and paused in the doorway long enough to study Pauline with an expression of genuine astonishment. "Miss Roberts," he said, "I have known you 3 years, and I confess I did not know until this exact moment that you were capable of rendering a grown man entirely speechless." "You are speaking, Mr. Goodwin." "Barely," he said, and offered her his arm with a small, knowing smile that told her he understood, better than most in that house, exactly how much this night would change before it ended. The ballroom at Harrogate House blazed with more candlelight than Pauline had ever seen gathered in one place, chandeliers dripping crystal above a sea of silk and jewels, the air thick with perfume and ambition. Cordelia arrived on the arm of her father, radiant, composed, utterly unaware that the room she walked into had already been turned against her, thread by careful thread, in the weeks since the banquet. Pauline stood near a tall window, watching the dancers turn beneath the chandeliers in patterns she had only ever glimpsed from service corridors, and felt the strange vertigo of standing, for once, on the visible side of a line she had spent her whole life observing from behind. Heads turned as she passed, not in scorn this time, but in curiosity, whispers trailing her like a perfume she had not asked to wear. She caught sight of Edmund across the room, elegant in black and gold, and the look he gave her, brief and burning, and entirely unguarded, told her that whatever happened in the hours ahead, he had already decided which version of his life he intended to choose. Edmund waited until the dancing had paused, until enough of society's most influential tongues had gathered close enough to hear, before he raised his voice across the room. "Lady Cordelia," he said, and the music stopped, And 300 faces turned the way 300 faces had once turned toward Pauline in a different hall, weeks before. I believe an explanation is owed to this room regarding the contents of a wine glass at our engagement banquet. Cordelia's composure did not crack immediately. She lifted her chin, the same wounded grace she had performed once before. "Edmund, must we revisit this unpleasantness in front of our friends? The poor maid was mistaken, and I have already forgiven her for it." The maid was not mistaken. Edmund's voice carried clean across the silent room. Dr. Ambrose Clark confirmed the wine contained a slow poison, designed not to kill me but to weaken my mind over time, so that I might be declared unfit to manage my own affairs. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd, like wind through a field. A woman near the punch table pressed a gloved hand to her mouth. An older gentleman muttered something to his wife about having always distrusted the Kensington smile, too perfect to be entirely honest. The orchestra, uncertain whether to continue, let their instruments fall silent one by one, until the only sound in the vast room was the soft creak of 300 people shifting their weight, waiting to see which way the story would break. "And once unfit," Edmund continued, "the estate's finances would have passed entirely into your hands, Cordelia, by virtue of forged documents prepared by your associate, Mr. Sebastian Vaughan, whose financial arrangement with your father I have here in writing." For one breathless moment, no one in the ballroom moved at all, as though the entire gathering had silently agreed to wait and see whether Cordelia could talk her way free of a trap that had taken months to build. Charles stepped forward with the papers, the forged seals, the misaligned crest, proof laid bare under chandelier light for every gathered witness to see with their own eyes. Cordelia's face, for the first time since Pauline had known her, stopped performing. What replaced the performance was not fear. It was rage, raw and unguarded, twisting her beautiful features into something the room had never been permitted to see before. "You ungrateful, suspicious man," she hissed, loud enough now that pretense had become pointless. "I would have given you an heir. I would have given you a perfect house, a perfect name beside yours in every record that mattered. Is that worth so little to you that you would destroy me over the word of a servant?" "It was never worth little," Edmund said quietly. "It was worth everything, which is precisely why I could not give it to someone who only wanted my weakness, never my company." He turned then, before the gathered crowd, away from Cordelia entirely, and found Pauline standing near the edge of the room in her borrowed blue silk, her hands clasped tightly before her, the way they always were when she felt the world watching too closely. "Ashcroft Abbey stands tonight," Edmund said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom, "because one woman in that house had the courage to speak when everyone else in the room chose silence. I do not believe in debts that can be repaid with words alone, but I believe in honoring courage where I find it." And then, before 300 witnesses who had once called her hysterical, who had once turned their faces away from her in corridors, Edmund Sterling, Duke of Ashcroft, bowed to Pauline Roberts as though she were the highest-ranking person in the room. The silence that followed was unlike any silence Pauline had known. It was not the silence of judgment. It was the silence of a room recalculating everything it had believed about worth and rank and who deserved to be seen. Behind them, 2 constables Edmund had quietly arranged in advance stepped forward to escort Cordelia from the ballroom, her protests trailing behind her into the night, like smoke from a fire finally extinguished. Her father, Lord Kensington, stood frozen near the punch table through all of it, his face draining of colour as the full weight of his family's ruin settled over him in front of every person whose good opinion he had spent his life cultivating. He did not move to defend his daughter. He did not move at all, until one of the constables touched his elbow gently, and suggested, with the practiced courtesy reserved for the suddenly powerless, that he might wish to follow his daughter out before the gathered crowd found its voice again. "I did not know," he said, to no one in particular, his voice thin and lost. "I swear before God, I didn't know what she had become capable of." No one in the room offered him comfort. Whether or not his ignorance had been genuine, it had been convenient. And convenient ignorance, Pauline thought, watching him go, was its own kind of guilt, even when it wore a different face than Cordelia's had worn. Charles Goodwin brought the news himself, arriving at Ashcroft 3 days after the ball, with mud still clinging to his boots from the journey. "Constables took him at the docks in Dover, Your Grace, not 2 hours before his ship was set to sail. He had the family silver wrapped in linen at the bottom of his trunk, and a letter from Lady Cordelia in his coat pocket, promising him passage money the moment she came into her inheritance. He will hang for the forgeries alone, I should think, without even touching the matter of the poison." "And Lord Kensington?" Edmund asked. "Ruined, Your Grace, though I confess I find it difficult to summon much pity for a man who looked away from his own daughter's character for so many years, simply because looking away was more comfortable than looking closely." Pauline, listening from the doorway, thought of her own father, who had never had silver to hide or debts to disguise, only a small failed farm, and a daughter he had been forced to send away to survive, and found the contrast between the two men sat strangely in her chest. Neither pity nor satisfaction, settling easily where the other might have expected it to. Cordelia Kensington's trial was held quietly, away from the public hunger that might have made a spectacle of Ashcroft's name, though every household of consequence in the county knew the truth of what had happened before the year was through. Sebastian Vaughan was found within the month, attempting to flee to the continent with what remained of the Kensington family silver, and the forged documents he had once been so proud of became the very evidence that ended his freedom. The Kensington estate, already drowning in debt before the conspiracy began, was sold within the year, to settle what remained of the family's obligations. The weeks that followed Cordelia's exposure moved strangely for Pauline, half triumph and half disorientation, the way a person feels stepping off a ship after a long voyage and finding the solid ground beneath their feet somehow less steady than the deck had been. The household that had once turned its face from her in corridors now studied her with a curiosity she did not know how to answer. Maids who had whispered against her now sought her favor. Footmen who had called her hysterical now bowed their heads when she passed, uncertain, suddenly, of exactly what rank she now occupied, in a house that had no precedent for a maid who had been bowed to by a duke in front of all society. Pauline found she didn't want their new deference any more than she had wanted their old scorn. She wanted only the quiet hours in the library, the candlelight, the man who had never once, through all of it, looked at her as anything less than a person whose voice mattered as much as his own. Pauline did not return to carrying linens after the ball at Harrowgate House. Edmund had not, as some lesser man might have done, swept her into a hurried marriage in the glow of scandal and gratitude, however much the temptation must have lived in him during those first weeks after the truth came out. Instead, he had done something Pauline had not expected from a duke. Something that told her, more than any declaration could have, exactly what kind of man he truly was. He gave her time. He arranged for her education, tutors who came twice a week to teach her the letters and numbers and history that her years scrubbing floors had never permitted her to learn. He gave her a small allowance and a room of her own, away from the servants' quarters, but not yet within the family wing, a space that belonged to neither her old life nor a life she had not yet chosen to claim. He told her, plainly and only once, that she owed him nothing for any of it, that her freedom to choose her own future mattered more to him than the speed at which she chose it. The lessons were not easy. Pauline had a quick mind, but little patience for sitting still after years of work that demanded her hands more than her head, and her tutor, a thin, anxious man named Mr. Pratt, often left her sessions looking more exhausted than she did. She argues with Latin as though it has personally offended her, he told Charles once, mopping his brow in the corridor. I have never taught a pupil who debated the grammar itself rather than simply memorizing it. That, Charles said, with the particular dry satisfaction of a man fond of someone against his own better judgment, is precisely why His Grace finds her so impossible to stop thinking about, Mr. Pratt. I would advise you to consider it a compliment to her character, rather than an obstacle to your lessons. Pauline, listening from the next room, with a book held up to hide her smile, found she did not mind being discussed so plainly, not when the discussion was kind, not when it came from people who had become, without either side quite choosing it, something close to family. You saved my life, and asked for nothing in return, he told her one evening in the library, the same room where so much of their quiet courtship had unfolded in stolen hours and careful words. I will not now ask you to spend that courage paying me back with a marriage you have not had the freedom to choose. There had been a night, some weeks before, when the careful distance between them had nearly broken entirely on its own, without either of them choosing it. They had been walking the long gallery after supper, the portraits of sterling ancestors watching them pass in the candlelight, when Pauline had stopped beneath a window and said, more plainly than she had ever allowed herself to speak before, the fear that lived beneath every quiet hour they had shared since the ball. Men like you do not marry women like me, she had said, watching the snow fall beyond the glass rather than his face, because she could not bear to watch his expression while she said it. I have heard it said my whole life, by people who meant it as a kindness, a warning meant to spare girls like me the pain of wanting what we were never permitted to have. I have tried to remember it, these past weeks, every time I have caught myself wanting something I have no right to want. Edmund had been quiet a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had carried none of the careful distance he usually kept between his words and his heart. I have heard it said too, he admitted, by men who built every comfort of their lives on rules exactly like the one you have just repeated to me. I confess I believed it myself, once, before a maid ran across my own banquet hall and showed me, in a single breath of courage, more honesty than I had received from anyone of my own rank in 30 years. He had reached for her hand then, in the cold gallery, beneath the painted eyes of ancestors who had never once, in 300 years of portraits, looked at a servant the way he looked at her. You are not asking me to break a rule, he had said quietly. You are asking me to admit that the rule was never worth keeping in the first place. Those are different questions, Pauline, and I have already answered the second one in my own heart. I am only waiting until I am certain you have answered it in yours, freely, without the weight of gratitude pressing you toward an answer you haven't truly chosen. She had not answered him that night. She had simply let him hold her hand a little longer than propriety allowed, and walked the rest of the gallery in a silence that said far more than either of them, yet had the courage to put into words. That memory lived between them still, unfinished, when Edmund asked her, in the library some weeks later, whether she thought him a coward for the second time that winter. And if I choose it freely, Pauline said, will you still hesitate to ask? Edmund's eyes found hers across the candlelight, warm and uncertain, in a way that made her chest ache with something she had stopped trying to name weeks ago. "I have been hesitating for months, Miss Roberts, out of respect rather than doubt. But I confess the hesitation grows harder to bear with every week that passes." "Then perhaps," Pauline said softly, "you might consider bearing it a little less." He crossed the room to her then, slowly, the way a man approaches something precious rather than something owed to him. And when his hand found hers, it was not to examine an old burn this time, but simply to hold it, his thumb tracing the same gentle path it always seemed to find, as though her hand had become a place he returned to, without deciding to. "I have thought of little else," he admitted, his voice low, "since the night you pulled that letter from the fire. I think of your courage. I think of your laughter, which you give so rarely and so completely when it finally comes. I think of how the house feels different on the days you are in it, lighter somehow, as though some weight I didn't know I carried has been set down." "Your Grace," Pauline said, though the title had begun to feel like a private joke between them, rather than a wall. "Edmund," he corrected gently. "When we are alone, you may call me Edmund." "Edmund," she said, testing the shape of it, the intimacy of it, and watched something in his face soften further at the sound of his own name from her mouth. "I have thought of you too, more than I should have allowed myself to, given everything that separates us." "What separates us," he said, "is nothing but the courage to ignore people who have never once shown either of us real kindness." He did not kiss her that night, though the wanting between them had grown thick enough to taste, a hunger built slowly over months of stolen glances and careful distance, of hands that lingered too long over wounds and books and the small accidental brushes that came from sharing a room too late into the evening. It was a different kind of intimacy they had built, one made of trust before touch, of respect before desire. And when his hand finally rose to cradle her cheek, his thumb brushing slow and reverent along her jaw, Pauline felt the ache of it settle deep in her chest, a longing that had been waiting patiently for permission it had finally, quietly, received. "Soon," he murmured, his forehead resting lightly against hers, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath, close enough that the space between their mouths had become its own kind of conversation. "When you are ready to be chosen and not simply rescued, I will ask you properly. Until then, I will be patient. Though I confess, patience has never been harder to practice than it is standing this close to you." Pauline closed her eyes, let herself feel the warmth of his hand against her skin, the steady thrum of his heartbeat where her palm had found his chest without quite meaning to. "Then practice it a little longer," she whispered. "Because when you finally ask, Edmund Sterling, I intend to say yes with my whole heart, and I would rather wait for that than rush toward anything less." 8 months passed between the ball at Harrogate House and the evening Edmund finally asked the question he had been carrying so carefully for so long. Those months had their own quiet rhythm, a slow unfolding that neither of them rushed, though the wanting between them deepened with every week that passed, an ache that lived just beneath the surface of every ordinary conversation, every shared meal, every evening spent reading in the same room with the careful, deliberate distance of two people who knew exactly how badly they wanted to close the space between their chairs and chose, again and again, to wait until waiting was no longer necessary. There were evenings when Edmund would catch her watching him across the room and hold her gaze a beat too long, evenings when Pauline would find some excuse to brush past his shoulder, simply to feel the warmth of him for half a second longer than propriety required. The hunger between them had not faded with time. If anything, the patience they practiced had only sharpened it, turned it into something steady and certain rather than the frantic urgency of new desire, a longing that had learned to wait because it had already decided it was willing to wait forever, if forever was what honoring each other required. Pauline had changed in that time, though not in the ways the old society matrons whispered about at their teas, not merely in dress or education, or the careful polish of manners that tutors had patiently built upon a foundation that had always, quietly, been there. She had changed in the way a person changes when they are finally permitted to take up space in the world, to speak and be heard, to want things and believe, for the first time in her life, that wanting them was not a sin reserved for people of better blood. Ashcroft Abbey held its winter ball that year in the same dining hall where the engagement banquet had once nearly ended in murder, and Edmund had insisted on it deliberately, the way he insisted on facing every wound by walking straight through its centre rather than around its edges. The staff had spent a full week preparing the hall, and Pauline, no longer required to carry trays or polish silver, found herself instead directing the preparations alongside Mrs. Shaw, the two of them standing where Pauline had once stood, frozen with a tray pressed to her stomach, now discussing the placement of candles and garlands as equals rather than mistress and maid. "It is strange," Pauline admitted, "to stand in this room and feel nothing but peace, when for so long it was the place I feared most in this house." "That is what courage earns you, in the end," Mrs. Shaw said, adjusting a length of holly along the mantel. "Not the absence of fear, but the right to stand in the room that once frightened you and find it has become, simply, a room." "The room should remember something other than fear," Edmund told Pauline, as the staff strung garlands of holly and ribbon along the same walls that had once echoed with her warning cry. "It should remember this too." Pauline spent the hours before the ball alone in her room, watching the snow gather against the window glass, and found herself thinking unexpectedly of the girl she had been 2 years before, pressing a tray to her stomach and telling herself that her place in the world was to be useful and never seen. That girl could not have imagined this room, this dress, this life waiting just beyond the door. That girl had believed, because every voice around her had insisted it was true, that a maid's worth was measured only by her usefulness to people who would never learn her name. She thought of her mother, who had died believing her daughter's life would always be smaller than her own had been. She thought of the vial slipping from Cordelia's glove, the second that had changed everything, the moment she had chosen to break every rule rather than watch a man drink poison in silence. She thought, finally, of Edmund's face in the candlelight of the library, the way he had looked at her, not as a duke looks at a servant, but as a man looks at someone he has decided, quietly and completely, that he cannot imagine his life without. She was no longer the girl who disappeared into corners. She had not disappeared in 2 years. Not once. Not even when disappearing would have been easier, safer, the path every lesson of her childhood had prepared her to choose. She had spoken instead, again and again, and the world, slowly and against every expectation she had ever carried, had begun to listen. A knock came at her door, and Charles's voice, warm with affection, he no longer bothered to hide. "His Grace requests your presence in the hall, Miss Roberts. I believe he has something rather important to ask you, though he has sworn me to silence on the particulars, which I confess has been the hardest secret I have kept in 11 years of service." Pauline smiled, smoothed the deep blue silk Mrs. Shaw had altered for her once more that winter, and walked toward the hall where her whole life had once changed in a single breath, ready to let it change again. When the dancing paused and the room quieted, Edmund didn't call for silence the way he had once called for it to expose a traitor. He simply crossed the floor to where Pauline stood, near the same service door she had once watched the world through as an invisible girl with a tray pressed to her stomach, and he knelt before her in front of guests who had once doubted her, and now, every one of them, understood exactly what kind of woman they were watching. "Pauline Roberts," he said, and his voice did not shake the way it had not shaken on the night he refused to drink the poisoned wine. Steady even now, even here. You stood in this very room and risked everything you had to save a life that was not yours to save. You asked for nothing in return. Not then, and not in all the months since. I told you once, by a fire in this house, that you were not trouble. I have had a great deal of time since then to understand how small a word that was for what you actually are. I have watched you become educated and elegant and free to choose any future you wished, and in every single version of that future I imagined for you, I found that I wanted, more than anything I have ever wanted in my life, to be standing somewhere inside it. He took a small velvet box from his coat, his hands, for the first time since Pauline had known him, not entirely steady. "Will you come to Ashcroft?" he asked. "Not as the woman I saved, but as the woman who saved me?" The room held its breath the way it had held its breath once before, in fear. This time the silence held something gentler. Hope, perhaps, or the particular ache of watching a story end exactly the way every good heart in the room had been quietly praying it would. Pauline looked down at the man kneeling before her, the Duke who had bowed to a maid in front of all of society, who had given her time instead of demanding her gratitude, who had waited 8 patient months for her to choose him freely rather than out of debt or rescue or the desperate hunger of 2 lonely people who had found, against every rule written to keep them apart, that they belonged to each other. "Yes," she said, and her voice did not shake either. "Not anymore. Edmund Sterling, I will come to Ashcroft as your wife, and as your equal, and as the woman who will spend the rest of her life grateful that she chose to speak the truth in a room that taught her whole life, to stay silent." He rose and kissed her then, finally, fully, in front of every witness who had once turned their faces away from her in disgraced corridors, and the room erupted into applause, loud enough to shake the same chandeliers that had once trembled with gasps of horror on the night a maid dared to interrupt a duke's wedding feast. The glass that had nearly killed him stood that night on a small shelf in the library where Edmund had kept it ever since Dr. Clark's examination, a quiet, private reminder of how close the house had come to ruin, and how far it had travelled since. It was not displayed for guests, nor spoken of beyond the 2 of them. It was simply there, catching candlelight on quiet evenings, a glass that had once carried poison and now carried only the memory of a warning that had saved everything that mattered. In the years that followed, the staff at Ashcroft Abbey would tell the story to new servants arriving at the house for the first time, a kind of legend passed quietly from one generation of service to the next, of the maid who had broken every rule she had ever been taught, because silence, that night, would have cost more than rebellion ever could. They told it not as a warning against speaking out of turn, but as the opposite, a reminder that courage sometimes wore an apron and carried a tray, and that the smallest voice in a room was sometimes the only voice telling the truth. Pauline never forgot what it had cost her to speak that first time, the fear that had nearly silenced her. The years of training that had taught her invisibility was safety. but she never regretted it either. Not for a single day of the long, full life she built afterward, in the rooms that had once made her feel so small, and that had grown, slowly and surely, to feel entirely like home. She told him not to drink that night. He listened. And because he listened, he lived long, enough to love her, fully, freely, and without a single secret standing between them ever again. Their wedding, when it came that spring, was small by the standards of the rank Pauline now carried, attended by the people who had earned a place in their lives, rather than the people who believed a place was owed to them by birth alone. Mrs. Shaw wept openly, declaring loudly that she had not cried at a wedding since her own, decades before, and that she certainly had not intended to begin again, before dissolving into tears for the second time within the hour. Charles stood as witness and raised his glass at the small gathering afterward, to declare, with the particular dry warmth he reserved for the people he loved most, that he had never in 11 years of service seen his employer face a single negotiation, no matter how delicate, with even half the courage he had shown, chasing after one stubborn maid. Ashcroft Abbey, in the years that followed, became known not for the scandal that had nearly destroyed it, but for the quiet, unshakable partnership of the Duke and Duchess who ran it, two people who had learned, in the worst night of their lives, exactly what kind of courage truly mattered, and had spent every day since refusing to forget the lesson. If this story moved you, if Pauline's courage stirred something in your own heart, do not let that feeling pass quietly. Like this video, and let it carry her story further than this room ever could. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of courage, justice, and love that refuses to bow to rank or rule, and ring the bell so you never miss the next tale waiting to be told. Leave a comment below and tell me which moment of Pauline's journey stayed with you the longest. Thank you, truly, for staying until the very last word. Stories like this one exist because viewers like you choose to listen all the way to the end, and that choice means more than you know. Until the next story, take care of yourselves, and never be afraid to speak the truth, even when the whole room teaches you to stay silent. I will see you in my next video. Bye.